At Professional Risk Management Services, our medical liability insurance program for psychiatrists and behavioral health group practices, the Psychiatrist Program, is designed to meet your needs throughout the various stages of your career. As a national psychiatry-specific program, a policy with PRMS can cover child and adolescent, forensic, early career, and military psychiatrists, as well as moonlighting residents and fellows, part-time practitioners, and telepsychiatrists. Learn more about how PRMS can protect you.
For those of you who don't know me, my name's Hera Mahayuddin. I'm your host for this evening's podcast. As you know, the Washington Psychiatric Society has initiated this podcast as a continuation of the career leadership and mentorship sessions that used to be held, and now it's in the form of a podcast where trainees have the opportunity to interview leaders in the field. And so, in terms of introducing myself, I'm an APA Gene Spurlock Congressional Fellow, resident fellow representative to the APA Assembly for the Mid-Atlantic region, and fellow member of the APA Council on Psychiatry and the Law. I have the privilege of introducing my supervisor and mentor, Dr. David Joseph, as our special guest tonight. Dr. Joseph is a training and supervising analyst at the Washington-Baltimore Center for Psychoanalysis. For many years, he was the director of psychiatry residency training at St. Elizabeth's Hospital, and he's a clinical professor in the GW Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences. He has a long-standing interest in psychiatric ethics and has co-authored the chapter on confidentiality in psychiatric ethics by Block and Green. His book, Listening for a Lifetime, was recently published by Mission Point Press, which I've read, and I'm going to show you a picture of here because it's so good and I want everyone to get it. Having read this book, I cannot recommend it highly enough for residents as well as early career and experienced psychiatrists, as there are learning points for each. And thank you for taking the time to speak with us today, Dr. Joseph.
It's fun. I'm looking forward to it. We should have a good conversation between ourselves and with everybody else.
Absolutely. We'll be sure to get everybody started with thinking. I have a few questions. I hope to speak about your book. Before we get there, I'd like to ask some questions about your career, as these career leadership and mentoring sessions, or CLM sessions, are so helpful for our resident listeners. So I'd start off by asking if you can tell us about the unique roles that you've held and the evolution of your career.
Well, I came down here so I would in the public health service. It was the time of Vietnam. It was 1971, and I and my fellow residents didn't want to go to Vietnam, and we came here, and they assigned me to St. Elizabeth's Hospital, which I'd never heard of. And my wife and I and two kids moved down here, and we've never left. And I was assigned to a ward at St. Elizabeth's Hospital, and then pretty quickly was picked up by Dan Cowell, who was the director of medical education in the residency program at St. E's. And I stayed there from 1971 until I left in 2004, and did all kinds of things until the last number of years when I was the director of residency training. And one of my residents was, of course, your dad, and a number of other people that I had the pleasure and privilege of teaching are on this podcast.
He sends his regrets. He was very upset that he wouldn't be able to join today, but having had the chance to see him as a resident, as my dad, as someone that I sometimes ask questions to now, I can definitely say that you've served your country well by training hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, maybe thousands of psychiatrists, so over those 3 decades. And thank you for telling us more about it. I think hearing about these different roles that are held can inspire those who want to follow a similar trajectory. Can you tell us a bit about how you've seen the field of psychiatry change during your career?
Yep. I'll add one other thing. I was in the public health service for a couple of years. I knew I wanted to be a psychoanalyst as well as a psychiatrist. And so I started analytic training soon after I came here. And I've remained very involved in the Psychoanalytic Institute in a number of roles until I closed my clinical practice a couple of years ago. And so I've tried to combine academia and private practice. It's been a very good combination, although I've often wished there were more than 24 hours in a day. And it's hard to manage it all. I have no question that for me it was worth it. And so I continue to do both. Right now, I'm just teaching and supervising, but I tried to combine education and practice throughout my career.
And how important that is. Thank you for speaking a bit about your time at the Analytic Institute too. I understand that that has heavily shaped your career, and something that I'm certainly going to continue to ask about too later on. One of my questions I had first though was if you could tell us about how you have seen the field of psychiatry change throughout your career.
Well, I'll try not to get on a polemical high horse, but I'm very concerned about how psychiatry has changed because I think psychiatry is becoming depersonalized and is turning into a brain science to the detriment of our patients and to the detriment of our profession. I mean, on the one hand, there's been this huge explosion of information and knowledge about all kinds of things that people my vintage knew nothing about when we were residents. And it continues, obviously, it continues to explode with new information, whether we're talking about ketamine or you're talking about transmagnetic magnetic stimulation or you're talking about ketamine or whatever, or we're talking about what we know about psychiatric genetics. All of that is just developing at an unbelievable rate, and it is going to continue to do so. My concern is it's so seductive as an escape from the subjectivity of our science. And it seems to me that psychiatry is truly a biopsychosocial cultural science, and that a well-educated psychiatrist needs to know about the contributions of all of those factors in who we are as people and the kinds of things people come to see us for. And I worry that psychiatrists in training now are getting less and less clinical experience. They rarely see patients very long. They rarely see somebody more than once a year, once a week. And they don't realize the importance of the relationship, whether they're prescribing medication or working with a family or counseling a mother who's got a sick child. I think the residents today that I run across and young psychiatrists and what one reads, if you read in the journals, psychotherapy is gradually being eliminated from our skill set. And I worry about that.
That's something that's really important and something that you wouldn't consider as missing from training unless you hear it. And so I think it's really important that you discuss that today and that we find ways to incorporate it as much as possible in training so that you have that balanced perspective and can make decisions on how appropriately to use it in practice in the future. I wonder, I just thought of it, I didn't have this question prepared, but as you were speaking, if you view AI and its incorporation in psychiatric practice as an extension of this in ways such as, UpToDate or Open Evidence. These are platforms where they're trusted, but it's gathering all of the data. You put a question and it spits an answer. But UpToDate is different because it's clinician regulated. They review the evidence and place it in front of you, but Open Evidence is a bit different. And then there's also AI models where people can go and ask questions as if it's an AI therapist, which I know is something that's controversial, but for good reason because it's a new technology and I don't believe that it can replace the human connection of an interaction in the office. And I know that that's so important to you. So I just want to hear your thoughts about it.
Well, I hope you'll ask other questions that aren't on your list. If we have a good conversation, it ought to be that
Mhm.
spontaneous.
Mhm.
I mean, two things. Quite frankly, I don't know a huge amount about AI therapists.
Mhm.
I do think artificial intelligence, no matter how accomplished or how um, brilliantly created, will always be artificial therapy. Um, How good will artificial therapy be as compared to natural psychotherapy? I think that depends. And I just don't know enough, but I do believe that when psychotherapy really helps people to grow and to learn to deal with the kinds of things that are causing them pain in different ways, I believe that that is a more powerful and lasting transformation when it occurs between two people and between two people in the same room. Um, I think we're somatic as well as, to say the obvious, as well as psychological people. And one learns best about oneself and the other person when you're in the same room with them. And it's not that I'm opposed to telehealth and telepsychiatry, which is a godsend for many people who can't get to psychiatrists. But I don't think we should kid ourselves that AI and Zoom is a replacement from really talking based person to person in the same room.
That's something that you taught me in supervision. I thought was very, very important to incorporate and to learn because having started during COVID and having that slow transition back to the office, I'm really glad that you emphasize how important it is to have that connection and to for people to come back into the office.
I know
Um,
people who disagree quite strongly with me about that. And someone I respect said, and for some people it's better. But it seems to me, for example, if you want to talk about something that you're deeply ashamed of, it's going to be much more difficult if you're in the same room than if you're online.
Absolutely. It makes it easier I understand that there's differing opinions, but I'm very glad that you shared yours and I agree with it. So I think just to make sure that we have an opportunity to discuss your book because there's a lot of things that a lot of learning points, but I pulled a few so that people have a sense of the different topics you cover. Um, one thing you wrote, and I'm paraphrasing a bit, but you wrote that you view this as a culmination of your observations, experience, and clinical knowledge over the past 50 years. And with your aphorisms, you clearly and concisely explain psychoanalytic principles from the initiation of therapy to termination. I pulled a few that I hope we can speak about, which are helpful to me in my supervision, also new ones that others may find helpful. To start, there's the concept that thoughts and behaviors do not seem rational because we do not understand their rationale. So this is something that I found very helpful, and I was wondering if you could speak more to.
Sure. I particularly learned that from all my years at St. Elizabeth's Hospital, which of course saw a number of people who came in and were psychotic. And now keep in mind, I was in training at the end of the 60s and 1970. At that time, psychoanalytic thinking was still quite dominant at most major universities, departments of psychiatry. And um, medication was viewed at that time by many psychoanalysts in particular as being something that one should avoid because it would, among other things, blunt the patient's symptoms and their pain and make it less likely that they would engage in therapy. But I grew up learning that if you listen to somebody who is psychotic, A, as Sullivan said, they're much more simply like us than otherwise, and that you could learn that their thinking had its own logic if you could listen respectfully and carefully enough to understand it. And when you did understand it, then you had a very different relationship with the person you were talking with. This was a person who was struggling with whatever it was and was disorganized enough by the anxiety and what fury or whatever other affects he was dealing with to become disorganized and psychotic. And so it seems to me that to realize that there's a rationale which we may never understand allows us to relate as person to person rather than as a healthy person to a crazy person. And I think that makes a huge difference in terms of how helpful we are able or unhelpful we're able to be with someone.
I thank you so much for that, and I found it particularly helpful in maintaining curiosity because if I thought that there was a clear solution or answer to what someone was experiencing, I'm not curious enough about how their what sorts of gratification they may be receiving from behaving in a certain way, or it's just an opportunity to learn more. And so I appreciated learning that from you and thought it'd be helpful to
I think
discuss.
it's also
Um,
if someone's doing something that makes no sense to us, that's because we haven't spent enough time listening to understanding the sense it makes to them. And that's not true of people, just about people who are psychotic, people who are phobic, for example. I mean, what are they phobic about? What is it about a spider? I mean, yes, there's something about rats that really, and spiders that spooks people, but there's often more to it than that. And so it allows us to really not just to listen to, but to relate to our patients in a different way.
Absolutely. And in terms of that topic, there's also other topics that are not often explicitly discussed in our in residency training, but learned through experience. And having read them, I think hearing these concepts discussed sooner and reading them in your book can help navigate these situations. So I've pulled a couple of those to discuss as well. So the first would be um, I think for a lot of our experienced listeners, this may seem very obvious or something that they've negotiated through their experience, but paying more or less than they can afford harms the patient and the therapist. So that was something I thought may be helpful for residents to hear.
Well, I'm not sure that everyone heard the aphorism particularly fully, but it says basically that for a patient to pay more or less than he or she can afford is hurtful to the treatment, to the patient, and to the therapist. If someone's paying me less than they can afford to pay, either they feel they're shortchanging me, they feel that they've gotten away with something. Um, on some level, I will think that I'm not being, I will have some sense, whether it's acknowledged that I'm being shortchanged, and it's not in the patient's interest or mine. And the same thing would be true if I charged more than the patient could afford, it sets up a similar kind of difficulty. And I wrote that aphorism, or I put it in the book, because I think many of us have such difficulty thinking about and talking candidly with patients about their finances. And I remember early in my career, someone said they couldn't pay me the fee I was asking. And when I asked if they had any savings, they said yes, but they weren't going to, that was out of bounds. And that it wasn't even open for discussion. Had I not asked, I wouldn't have known. On the other hand, I don't want to be an IRS agent and pour through somebody's record. So it's a very sensitive, but I think an important aspect of clinical practice. And you try to negotiate something that seems, my word is fair. It's certainly not a very precise term, but I hope the patient and I are comfortable that we've arrived at a quote, a contract that they really, and that I really am comfortable with.
And something that I'm very glad that you discussed because many residents are not comfortable thinking about that yet or don't consider that because it's not a part of until you're a fourth year resident that you start thinking about how you'll run whatever type of practice you'll have after you graduate. And so I appreciate that context because uh, it also includes why having a number amount or some value helps the patient to also value the work that you're doing. Um,
And of
I
course,
think
most residents program that I know about, they don't discuss fees. It's the fees are set by the department, and
exactly.
the
Yes.
resident is just providing the service. So it isn't even part of your learning, or if it is, it's purely abstract. It's one
Mhm.
thing to read about it. It's another thing to sit down with somebody and say, my fee is X,
Mhm.
and then have some negotiation.
Absolutely. And Yeah, that makes sense. And the only sometimes exposure comes through moonlighting, but even then it's not a negotiation. So that experience and reading about it, hopefully something to incorporate when I graduate. Um, Two concepts which mirror each other in the book. And I say mirror, they actually are two chapters back to back, and I think that was deliberate, but you can tell me if not. But I mean, I'm sure it was. But the first is that the unknown therapist is an illusion, and the concept of self-disclosure is misleading. So I thought these two concepts would be really helpful.
Um, yes, I think the notion, first of all, the whole question of self-disclosure. Um, when I was a resident, the notion was that you were a mirror. You were a blank screen and you were a mirror and you reflected back to the patient what the patient was, at least in terms of what the patient saw of you was nothing, quote, very personal. But two things. One, people who really adhered to that way of relating to a patient, in my experience, were people who were very, very private. But even the most private of therapists. And this was back in the time when, again, when psychoanalysis and a particularly distorted version of psychoanalysis about the blank screen um, was quite prominent. Patients know. They know when we're preoccupied, if someone in our family is sick, or if your spouse is gonna, your wife is going to give birth to a child, or if you're worried about having a medical test yourself, or you're sad, or whatever, patients know that. They pick it up in some way because we communicate it. They know, I think, what we experience about them. They know when we're mad. They know when we may be aroused. They may know when we're sad. And it doesn't, for me, the goal is I don't want to burden the patient with what's on my mind. But I certainly don't want to be impersonal. My person is very much, and I think everybody's person is very much a part of the kind of work we do. And it's why we work well with some people and not with others. It's, and so I think there's no reason to hide from patients. It's quite the opposite.
And I appreciate that perspective because I remember in our supervision is one of the first things we talked about was what to disclose, how to disclose, and how it's having a universal rule is more harmful than helpful, and
Right.
how it has to be reevaluated for each patient in each situation, which really helped my learning and I thought would be good to discuss,
It
including.
does put you on the
Mhm.
spot if you have to make the decision with every patient and every question or every comment. It means you've got to say, well, am I going to answer or not? I had a colleague friend of mine who was in analysis, and when he was going to start his analysis at the end of I don't know how many meetings he met with his he was in analytic training. He met with his training analyst, and the analyst said, "Do you have any questions? Because once we start, I won't answer any questions." And the guy never did. I don't know if my friend asked any questions, but as far as I know, they were never answered. And that just seems to me you don't have to wrestle with the question, is it going to further the treatment to answer this question? Or is it going to further the treatment not to? You can just always say, well, I won't, and just make the same decision every time.
It's certainly more challenging to make the decision every time, but I can see the benefit uh, of making the determination uh, to 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 further your training and also the treatment for the patient. So I appreciate that discussion.
Well, and even if you say you don't, it's a fixed issue and you never answer a question, you're still questioning your principle every time you choose not to answer a question.
Mhm. That makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. Um, and I think it also ties into my next topic, which is um, how you discuss practical solutions to awkward situations, which I'm sure each time is an evaluation of how to respond in that situation, and how best to approach them. So there were some situations that you described, quote unquote, in the book as awkward, that I thought very helpful to see on paper because already some have happened, and so to see that there are practical solutions or you've thought that there are ways to approach it. One of these was forgetting an appointment and finding two patients in the waiting room. And I was wondering if you could speak to how you developed a level of comfort with addressing these situations and opportunities.
I don't think I said I did. I never developed a level of comfort with that because I always
Mhm.
felt uncomfortable. Um, I particularly felt uncomfortable if it turns out, or I was pretty sure it was my mistake. Um, but you're caught in this difficult dilemma of, I mean, sometimes the two people will resolve the problem themselves, but if it's my fault and I've double booked, then it's sort of like, well, it's not as awful as Sophie's Choice, which is a novel in which the Nazis forced a woman to choose which of her two children was going to go to the gas chambers. It's always been one of the most anguishing books I've ever read. But how do you decide which person you're going to see and which person you're not? And do you let the patient decide? In which case, a self-sacrificing person will say, no, I'll go. And then the fallout is always something you have to deal with the person you see and the person you don't see. So I never got comfortable, and I hope I never would, because it's intrinsically a pretty uncomfortable position, but we make mistakes and we do the best we can, and we live with the consequences of the mistakes as well as we live with the consequences of our successes. So, and it's happened to all of us. I'm sure everybody who's listening has had that happen, not many times, but it's certainly pretty common.
It's common but not discussed formally. And so by you sharing it with us in your book, it makes it less uh, stigmatizing or scary, I guess, that it should happen.
Well, and
Um,
I hope it helps people not to feel so ashamed that they never talk about it or that they feel that they never talk about it either with the patients. I mean, I've heard of instances where that happens. And if there's, say, two patients and a psychiatrist, then all three of them duck the issue and it never gets explored.
oh gosh, okay. And that's an example of what not to do, but something to learn from. But thank you for that. I want to leave time for others to ask questions, but I'll ask like just one or two more if that's all right.
Sure.
Um, So, not specific to the book, but because I have the opportunity to ask you these questions, and you've given your experience and your career, and I wanted to ask about since you've held so many leadership positions, what advice would you have for those who would like to take on leadership roles?
Well, one is a pretty old-fashioned piece of advice.
Mhm.
Get to be have enough clinical experience that you believe you are a good clinician. Um, because I think whatever leadership roles and administrative roles as psychiatrists that we might hold, that the more we have some confidence in our clinical skills and have clinical experience, the better we will do at the job that is not, quote, not clinical. Certainly, that was my experience at St. Elizabeth's. Whether I was teaching a class or whether I was a director of residency training, it was my experience at the Institute in a number of different roles that I thought I administered much better when I really was also a good clinician. It doesn't mean I treated residents or people I worked with as patients, but it meant I listened and I understood what was going on organizationally from a perspective that it included an understanding about unconscious behavior and group process. And it helped me develop interventions that I thought would be most helpful. And I'm convinced I did a better job the more clinical skills I had in doing administrative work. And I think many times people get into administration early on and don't see patients, which gets back to your question about psychiatric education, where people don't spend enough time learning how to understand our patients and how to listen to them.
Absolutely, and speaks to how it, you learn so much about the groups and the structure, but also you're better able to guide or teach or manage clinicians when you know exactly what they're doing because you've done it so much, and so that makes a lot of sense. And I was wondering if you could also tell us in your career what was the one aspect that you enjoyed the most.
Wow, that's a great question. I would say, I guess I would say it, talk about it from two perspectives. As a clinician, I think it's when I've been able to really develop a relationship in which someone allows them to know me as well as the two of us can manage, and that I'm able to help them transform their lives in ways that the things that they're dealing with and the lives they're leading are more productive and gratifying and meaningful, and the pain that they deal with, they can metabolize better. And I think from an organizational point of view, it's if one contributes to the life of the organization and the development and growth of the organization, that it really helps its members fulfill their own goals. Then again, I think it's the similar model. You help the organization to grow and develop and to accomplish things where the organization itself feels has more meaning and is more productive. I think that's the best way I can put it. But I do think that's what makes organizational work meaningful, is that you have this, the organization will grow and develop and mature and pursue the values that you feel are important. And those values, they're not different organizationally than they are personally. At least in many ways, they're not.
And it speaks to more of your legacy, not just the people that you've trained and who are all on this call, but also the systems that you changed and continue to leave that lasting impact. Um, I I wanted to leave some time. Dr. Joseph has graciously offered to stay after to answer more questions if we go over, but I know some people will have to log off on at 7:45. So if we can open it so others can ask questions, I can read them if you put them in the chat, or you can unmute, whatever you prefer. Just letting everyone know we are recording. So what if you're comfortable being on camera? Oh, Dr. Dunlap raised her hand.
Yes, hi. I don't have a question right now. I wanted to get some feedback about the book. I've started reading it, and I've also jumped around because of the way that it's written. And so, you mentioned Elvin Simrad, and I remember being in training, and you and other people mentioned him so much. I remember feeling kind of envious that I had not met this man. And I now think of you as like our Elvin Simrad, and think about all the wisdom that you've shared with us. And I just want to say I like the chapters. They're easy to read. You can move around, and I can relate to a number of scenarios, like the falling asleep. Um, you know, two people being in the waiting room. That doesn't happen so much now with the electronic calendars. These are real world situations that each of us can relate to. So I think of this as a gem, and I'm really glad that you decided to write it.
Oh, thank you, Connie. I both enjoyed and I learned a lot about myself in writing it. And when I started collecting these aphorisms that I'd written without knowing it. I was surprised with how many I came up with. And so I'm glad you found the book both readable. I hope the voice of the author is the voice have known all these years. I certainly tried to make it that way. That was one of my major goals.
It is. I hear you from supervision.
I'm glad.
David, I'll just add for a moment. I hear you from being a resident, and it just rings true. You you haven't missed a step, man. And I'm just so grateful for what you taught me. And as I listen to you about the value of people being people rather than we're not crazy and you are. And it has helped me so much in my forensic world, particularly when I'm talking in corrections to inmates. And I have never, and I knock on wood, been assaulted, had inmates throw anything on me, walking across a yard at San Quentin, hearing somebody yell out, "Hey, Dr. Patterson, you gonna see me today?" I'm there for 3 days. How many people can I see? But it's a connection that's established. And I really think that you're right on target. I tried to continue in correctional work during COVID, and you can't do it virtually. You just can't. And that's because there are other people in the room. So it's not just you and the patient. You're not in the room, you're on a screen, the patient's on a screen, but off the screen is an officer, is a deputy, is somebody. So how can that patient really be candid and honest with you when they live where they live and on the circumstances they're in? So that's a very hard thing to do. And I certainly agree with you that the person to person and the face to face is really important. But I also agree that there's some places where telepsych is really necessary because in some rural areas, et cetera, there are no psychiatrists or they're 50 miles away and they're not making that trip. So it's a balance. And I think your book really will help people put it in perspective. What is it that we're really doing here? We're not just medication managers, we're also people and therapist. And some of that has really gotten lost. So thank you.
Oh, I'm glad, and you made me think about something, and I'm not sure I really put this in the book powerfully enough. Hira's question to me about understanding someone's rationale. It's so important that we respect our patients and that they feel respected by us, regardless of what they've done. And certainly you've seen people who've done some horrendous things, and I did too at St. Elizabeth's and sometimes in my practice. And to find their humanness and their humanity and respect them for who they are without denying whatever horrendous things they've done. That just see it's a tall challenge for any of us, particularly for those of you who work in forensics. But I think it's true for people who are working in, they've got a Chevy Chase practice. That it's really important to respect our patients. They're doing the best they can. They're adapting to their own internal world with their own physical and psychological limitations the best they can. And for me, at least, having that perspective allows me to respect them, even if they've done some horrendous stuff.
Dr. Ridful has her hand raised next. Are you able to unmute?
Okay, got unmuted. So, of course, I've collected several things I wanted to say. I don't know which one to say first, but I was recollecting all the way back to when, as training director, you were willing to take on Shirley and myself as part-time residents. And people are still amazed today when I tell them that I did residency in family practice, adult psychiatry and child psychiatry. It took me 10 years and I was only in the hospital overnight for one of those years. So it was, and you know what? I think I'm just as good a child psychiatrist as any of the others. So,
How about better? How about better, Rachel?
but
Because
we
you were
could,
able to spend time with your kids.
oh, well, actually, it was great because I went to the nursery school and co-oped, and there's a movement afoot to try for psychiatry residents and child fellows to offer electives in child development when someone's out on parental leave so that they don't lose any training time because people have been held back from entering the job cycle with everybody else if they owe a month or something still to training time, which seems to me somebody's not really trying to help them. But anyhow, I think it's a great idea. And an idea that sort of goes with that was the question of that blank screen, because I guess I grew up around a lot of people who were debating that. 'Cause my father certainly wasn't the most comfortable of to be a blank screen. And he said, you should at least be a decent human being. If somebody trips, you can lend them a hand, that kind of thing. But then studying like Beatrice Beebe's work and realizing that a blank screen is actually a noxious stimulus. It's not neutral.
No.
And we have to, keep that thought in mind. And then the last one is, I don't know if anybody else here knows people not in the field who've read the book. I recommended it to my book club, and they're going to try to decide. But this is a group of neighborhood women in their 60s, 70s, pushing 80, who meet once a month for the past 20 years, reading books, mostly nonfiction. And I don't know what they think, but anyhow, I thought it'd be fun.
Well, I'm really glad that you thought it would be meaningful to people not in the field. I certainly hoped it would be, and a number of people who have read it who aren't in the field at all and aren't married to people in the field have felt that it's been readable and accessible and understandable. It seems to me that psychoanalytic thinking is readily understandable and pertinent to all of us. And so I tried to write it in a way that anybody who was interested would understand it without dumbing it down.
And children, in some way, are like patients with psychoses. They think a little differently than adults, but if you respect them and you're really trying to understand, it makes a huge difference as opposed to just modifying their behavior.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I worried about child psychiatry now. I mean, I'm sure you do too. Someone's anoretic and bingo, they're on whatever they're putting anoretic kids on now before they even know the child's name.
Right. It is a challenge. I don't want to hog all the time. We have some. We're working on it. We're working on it, but just to.
I wasn't aware that the WPS had this program for residents to interview members of the society. I think it's a great idea. And I just think it's a helpful for somebody's development, and it helps them think about their training in a different way.
I'm really glad you still think so after today.
Oh,
I
especially after today.
thank you so much, Dr. Joseph. I don't see any other hands, but if you have a question, please feel free to ask it or comment.
I just think that, how often does psychiatry stay in a family line, I suppose, because you mentioned that your father's a psychiatrist, right? And I have both a father and a son who are psychiatrists. So it's sort of how it,
Oh, wow. I don't
how,
often meet another multi-generational psychiatrist family, so thank you for telling.
there must be a couple more. We couldn't be the only ones.
My
My
dad
daughter-
would have been a psychoanalyst if the depression hadn't come and made it impossible.
Mhm. Yeah. My dad felt like he squeaked in just before the GIs returned from the front in World War II. He had a club foot, so he couldn't go in the military in those days. And So I don't know whether he would or wouldn't have gotten in the class later, but it's a different time. But I think psychodynamics is making a comeback, and in child psychiatry, it always appeals to trainees and stuff because the kids engage so well when you understand them in that way. So, and they don't understand you if you just yak at them in grown-up speak. So
Here, I think Connie Dunlap has got a hand raised.
Yes.
Yes.
So one thing I wanted to say about this book is that what I appreciate is it really is grounded in a psychoanalytic approach. And as you say in the book, I mean, that's who you are, that's your being. And it's important, especially now as training programs are cutting back on the amount of therapy trainees are required to do. I have a question that I asked you some time ago, and I want to ask it again. I also want to acknowledge Dr. Morgan, your interview, and you're connected to this question. David, I asked you, you invited me to come over to teach a continuous case conference for the PGY3s, and Dr. Farouk Moyadin was in that class. And after spending time there, I remember asking you, the trainees were just phenomenal. I mean, I was just so impressed with the trainees, very diverse group, and also very psychodynamic and receptive. And I asked you, David, to say, how do you consistently choose these fantastic trainees? And I want to ask you if you can just comment on that. I mean, there was some formula that you had because consistently they were fantastic.
Well, I can tell you how I excluded them. Is if a resident said I'd never go into psychotherapy, which some people said, they would, I don't care what they got on their boards, they were not going to get in. And I think the best I could say, it depended on the quality of the interview, that if I felt that I could engage with them in a way where we could sort of learn something about each other, and that the resident came through as a person and seemed to value that experience in talking with me, then I thought it would be a pretty good indicator of how they would talk and relate to and think about their patients. And by and large, I think we did a really good job. There were some people that we didn't do a good job. We just made a mistake. And we ran across some tough things where you get into some conflict. I can remember one person who was I think he was from Liberia, and his grew up in a culture which was adamantly homophobic, and he really was not able to get beyond that. It was just socioculturally and personally so hardwired for this guy that it didn't change. And it was one, in retrospect, we weren't the right program for him. But I think he came out better than when he went in, but I have no illusions that that was someone where we made a mistake. And there weren't many of those, but there were others. But I think you get a feel for a person about how open are they to learning.
Well, I'm really glad that you've chosen so many wonderful future psychiatrists. It sounds like the majority were really, really amazing psychiatrists and have made a difference in the field. And I know we're getting close to time, so I want to just be mindful and see if anyone else has another quick question, or if we'll have to save them for another time we have the chance to speak with you.
I've enjoyed this. This has been fun, and from many perspectives.
I'm so glad. It was fun for me too. I'm really glad I got a chance to speak with you again.